In this lesson, we're going to take a look at snapping. Flash gives us some very powerful options here, and some of them make life a lot easier. We'll start with the basic snap to objects. Choose View, Snapping, and Snap to Objects here. With this turned on, Flash helps us align things. Say if I grab this object by the very center and drag it over here close to the first one, you can see at certain points the center circle gets bigger. Of course, this makes things a lot easier. We can also grab this by the very corner, and Flash will do the same thing, only aligning the corner. Quite handy. Now, let's look at an even more useful option, Snap Align. With this turned on, we can drag an object around, and you'll notice that at certain points dotted lines appear. Even though we're not right next to the first box on the left, Flash tells us that at the moment the vertical centers of the two objects are aligned. If we go down here, Flash will tell us about the horizontal alignment, and so on. This is quite useful. We can also even use this to make Flash tell us when objects are a certain distance apart. So imagine if we want to make an array of, say, 6 or 7 boxes, and we want them all to be aligned without having to go up to the Modify menu and choosing Align, we can just drag things around. And Flash will go, hey, they're aligned, and they're a specified distance apart. That's all good. We're going to cover these distance settings in the next lesson, so we won't worry about them just yet. But here's another feature of Snap Align. If I drag this over near the edge of our document, Flash can tell us when we're getting close, and in fact when we're at a specified distance. So this is really handy for positioning things around the outside edge of a document. Again, we can specify this distance, and we're going to look at that in the next lesson. But before we go there, let's have a look at the rest of the snapping options here. We have Snap to Grid and Snap to Guides, which we've recently covered, but we also have Snap to Pixels. So we'll turn off Snap Align and Snap to Objects and turn on Snap to Pixels. We don't see anything immediately apparent, but as I did with our lesson on the grid, I'll turn off the visibility of my background here and zoom in a couple of steps, and we see a grid. This looks a little bit like the grid we've already covered, but it's a little bit different. The grid cells are 1 pixel wide and 1 pixel high. Using this, you can tell Flash to make sure that all of our objects are aligned to exact pixel dimensions. Now I find this really handy because occasionally the Flash player has little problems drawing objects that aren't aligned to specific pixels. It will draw them, but they look a little bit fuzzy. So I'm a big fan of aligning things to exact pixels. Let's have a look in the Properties Inspector here. And down here in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the X and Y coordinates of this object. I'll drag it, and notice that they stay at whole numbers. If I turn Snap to Pixels off, we can drag it anywhere. And Flash may not draw this completely accurately. Now, before we finish this lesson, I'll explain one other thing that Snap to Pixels affects. With it turned off, if I use the arrow keys on the keyboard to nudge this, I'm nudging this to the right. Notice that the X position value of this for each nudge changes by 0.5 of a pixel. Now I'll zoom out. I'll zoom right out and do the same thing. Now it changes by 4 pixels. And a very similar thing happens if you hold down the Shift key while you're doing this. If I hold down the Shift key, one nudge is 40 pixels. But if I zoom back in, holding down the Shift key, one nudge is only 5 pixels. Okay, so we can see that the amount of nudging depends on how far you're zoomed in. Now let's turn Snap to Pixels back on. I'll zoom right in, align this to the pixels so it's easier to see, and one click of the arrow button moves our object 1 pixel. I'll zoom right out, and one click of the arrow button moves our object 1 pixel. This is a very small thing, but it's good to know. Whenever you have Snap to Pixels turned on, the amount of nudging remains the same whether you're zoomed in or not. And if I hold down the Shift key while I'm doing this, it moves by exactly 10 pixels. Zoom back in, and we still move 10 pixels. Now this is really useful for me because I'm a big fan of precisely positioning objects, and the Snap to Pixels option makes it a lot easier. Now that's it for this lesson. In the next one, we're going to have a look at our snapping options.